The Yak-9 was born out of the urgent need for a modern fighter that could match the Luftwaffe during the most critical stages of the Second World War. By 1941, the Soviet Union's primary frontline fighters, the Yak-1 and Yak-7, were already showing their limitations against the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the increasingly common Focke-Wulf Fw-190. The Yakovlev Design Bureau, under the leadership of Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, understood that a successor was required, one that would combine the agility and simplicity of the Yak-1 with greater range, heavier armament, and adaptability for multiple roles. The Soviet industrial situation shaped every decision. Aluminum was in short supply, factories had been evacuated eastward, and production needed to be as simple and scalable as possible. Yakovlev's team decided not to create an entirely new fighter, but to refine their existing designs into a more versatile platform. This approach would allow the Soviet Union to keep output high while incrementally improving combat performance. The Yak-9 emerged as a development of the Yak-7, itself a derivative of the Yak-1. At first glance, the new aircraft looked similar to its predecessors, but beneath the surface it incorporated crucial changes. The fuselage was redesigned with lighter materials, using a metal frame combined with wooden elements to balance strength and resource availability. This construction method allowed the Yak-9 to be mass-produced quickly without exhausting scarce metals. Perhaps the most important innovation was the emphasis on modular design. From the outset, Yakovlev envisioned the Yak-9 as a family of aircraft rather than a single model. Its airframe could be adapted to carry different engines, fuel loads, and weapon configurations, making it suitable for varied missions from dogfighting to ground attack. This adaptability would become a defining characteristic and one of the reasons the Yak-9 remained in service for so long. Strategically, the Red Air Force needed a fighter that could escort bombers, intercept German aircraft, and also contribute to close air support, often in the same operational theater. The Yak-9 was conceived to fill this wide range of tasks, bridging the gap between the nimble Yak-3 and the heavier Il-2 ground attack aircraft. By combining speed and maneuverability with options for heavier firepower, it was designed to give Soviet pilots a tool they could trust in diverse situations. The first blueprints and mock-ups were finalized in early 1942, even as the Soviet Union was still reeling from the Axis advance into its territory. Yakovlev's team worked under immense pressure, often with limited resources, to ensure that the new fighter could enter production without delay. By mid-1942, prototypes were being assembled, embodying the lessons learned from earlier Yak fighters and the frontline reports that emphasized the need for a balance of speed, endurance, and armament. The origins of the Yak-9 therefore lie not in a radical technological leap, but in a pragmatic, evolutionary response to the conditions of the Eastern Front. It was a fighter designed not only for air superiority, but also for survival. Survival of the pilots who flew it, the factories that built it, and the strategy of a nation that depended on its ability to produce weapons quickly and in vast numbers. In the crucible of war, the Yak-9 was shaped as a machine that could meet immediate needs, while providing a foundation for future development, a design philosophy that would soon make it the most numerous and versatile Soviet fighter of the war. The prototype phase of the Yak-9 began in the spring of 1942, when Yakovlev's Design Bureau assembled the first test models based on the Yak-7 framework. The engineers sought to achieve two principal improvements: a lighter airframe that would increase maneuverability and endurance, and more powerful armament that would allow Soviet fighters to engage German aircraft on equal or superior terms. To this end, the prototype employed a mixed construction of steel and aluminum for key structural components, combined with wood for non-critical sections. This hybrid approach saved precious alloys while keeping the overall weight of the aircraft low. Flight testing of the prototype took place in mid-1942 under the supervision of Soviet test pilots at airfields near Moscow. Initial results demonstrated that the Yak-9 had indeed surpassed its predecessors in agility and speed. The new fighter could reach a top speed of around 600 kilometers per hour, with a climb rate that matched the Bf-109F, then serving on the Eastern Front. The extended range provided by enlarged fuel tanks also gave the aircraft operational flexibility that earlier Yakovlev fighters lacked. This was especially important in the vast distances of the Eastern Front, where combat often occurred far from established bases. The early trials, however, also exposed technical difficulties. The M105PF engine, while reliable in many respects, struggled with overheating during sustained combat maneuvers, especially at low altitude. Engineers responded by adjusting the cooling system and modifying the cowling design, changes that would later be incorporated into serial production models. Armament was another challenge. The prototype initially carried a single 20mm HVAC cannon firing through the propeller hub and a single 12.7mm UBS machine gun. While adequate, frontline reports demanded heavier firepower to counter German bombers and heavily armored fighters. Later prototypes would experiment with twin machine guns or larger cannons, though these modifications always had to balance firepower with the aircraft's performance. Pilots involved in the testing phase generally praised the Yak-9's handling characteristics. Compared to the Yak-7, the aircraft felt lighter and more responsive, particularly in turns. The visibility from the cockpit was also improved through refinements in the canopy, which enhanced situational awareness during dogfights. Soviet pilots emphasized that these qualities gave them confidence in combat, an important factor when facing experienced Luftwaffe opponents. Transitioning from prototype to production was made easier by the Yak-9's evolutionary nature. Because it shared many components with the Yak-7 and Yak-1, factories already geared to build earlier Yakovlev fighters could retool quickly. The Gorky and Novosibirsk plants were among the first to switch to Yak-9 production, with the first serial aircraft leaving assembly lines by late 1942. The emphasis remained on mass output, as the Red Air Force needed large numbers of modern fighters to replace heavy wartime losses. Production aircraft continued to incorporate modifications based on testing feedback. Adjustments to the cooling system reduced engine overheating, while minor structural refinements strengthened the airframe against combat damage. The first production series retained the mixed construction fuselage, but engineers were already planning greater use of metal in future models to improve durability. By the end of 1942, the Yak-9 was ready for operational trials at the front. The transition from prototype to active service had been achieved in record time, reflecting both the urgency of the Soviet war effort and the adaptability of the Yakovlev design. The testing phase had proven the Yak-9's potential, and although issues remained to be solved, the aircraft was poised to take its place as the backbone of the Soviet fighter force. In the months ahead, it would face the true test: combat against the Luftwaffe in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. The Yak-9 first entered service at the end of 1942, with frontline deliveries to selected units of the Soviet Air Force taking place during the Battle of Stalingrad. The timing was critical. The Red Army was engaged in one of the most decisive struggles of the war, and the need for a reliable modern fighter was acute. Initial batches were small, often just a handful of aircraft assigned to regiments already flying Yak-7s. This allowed pilots and ground crews to familiarize themselves with the new machine while continuing combat operations with familiar equipment. The early Yak-9s were tasked primarily with escorting bombers and conducting air patrols over contested sectors. In the skies above the Volga, pilots quickly learned that the Yak-9's improved agility and endurance gave them an advantage in engagements against the Bf-109F, which had until then dominated many confrontations. Soviet squadrons reported that the Yak-9 could now hold its own in prolonged dogfights, particularly at medium and low altitudes, where much of the Eastern Front air war took place. For bomber escort missions, the aircraft's extended range proved particularly valuable, allowing Soviet bombers to strike deeper targets while maintaining fighter protection. The transition to operational use was not without difficulties. Many of the first aircraft suffered from teething problems, such as engine overheating and limited ammunition supply for the nose-mounted cannon. Ground crews had to adapt quickly, improvising solutions to keep the fighters operational under the harsh winter conditions of 1942-1943. Despite these issues, combat reports confirmed that the Yak-9 represented a genuine step forward, raising morale among pilots who had previously struggled with the limitations of older designs. By the spring of 1943, Yak-9s were being delivered in greater numbers, with entire regiments re-equipped. One of the first large-scale deployments occurred during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history and a turning point on the Eastern Front. In this campaign, the Yak-9 flew both air superiority and ground attack missions, often engaging in intense dogfights with Bf-109Gs and Fw-190As. Pilots reported that while the Yak-9 was not always faster in a straight climb, It could outmaneuver its opponents in turning engagements, giving Soviet aviators tactical options they had lacked before. Commanders valued the Yak-9's versatility. In addition to pure fighter duties, it was often employed for close support missions, strafing German troop concentrations and attacking armored columns. While not as heavily armed or armored as the dedicated Il-2 Sturmovik, the Yak-9 could still inflict significant damage with its cannon and machine gun fire, particularly against lightly protected vehicles and supply convoys. This adaptability reinforced its growing reputation as a universal fighter capable of serving multiple battlefield roles. Reactions from Soviet pilots were generally enthusiastic. Many veterans who had flown the Yak-1 or Yak-7 described the Yak-9 as more refined and forgiving, with better stability in maneuvers and improved cockpit ergonomics. For younger pilots entering combat for the first time, the Yak-9's balance of performance and ease of handling provided a valuable learning platform. Reports sent to Moscow emphasized that the aircraft boosted confidence at the squadron level, an important factor at a time when air superiority remained contested. Military leaders also took note of the Yak-9's potential. Soviet high command recognized that while the Yak-3 would later become the lightest and most agile member of the family, the Yak-9 offered a wider range of possibilities. Its ability to be modified for long-range escort, heavy armament, or reconnaissance roles made it a strategic asset. This recognition influenced production decisions, with factories prioritizing the Yak-9 over older Yakovlev designs by late 1943. By the end of 1943, the Yak-9 was firmly established as one of the Red Air Force's principal fighters. It had proven itself in major operations, gained the trust of its pilots, and demonstrated the flexibility needed to adapt to shifting battlefield conditions. From this point onward, it would form the backbone of Soviet fighter aviation, playing a decisive role in the campaigns that carried the Red Army from defensive battles on its own soil to the offensive push into Eastern Europe. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the Yak-9 evolved from a promising frontline fighter into one of the mainstays of Soviet air power. The Red Army was now on the offensive across much of the Eastern Front, and the demands placed on its air force were immense. The Yak-9 became central to these operations, fulfilling multiple combat roles while adapting to the changing nature of the conflict. The aircraft's role in air-to-air combat remained its most critical contribution. Throughout 1944, Yak-9 regiments engaged Luftwaffe formations in support of the Red Army's offensives in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. By this time, the Luftwaffe was deploying improved versions of the Bf-109G and the Fw-190A, both formidable opponents. Soviet pilots, however, reported that the Yak-9 could successfully contend with these adversaries, particularly in turning engagements and at low to medium altitudes. The Yak-9's speed and agility allowed Soviet squadrons to hold their ground, while coordinated tactics ensured that numerical superiority often tipped the balance. One of the major adaptations during this period was the introduction of the Yak-9T, equipped with a 37mm NS-37 cannon firing through the propeller hub. This weapon gave the fighter significant striking power, capable of destroying bombers with a single hit and even threatening armored ground vehicles. Yak-9T pilots quickly became adept at using their aircraft against both air and ground targets. However, the recoil of the powerful cannon affected handling, requiring skill to maintain accuracy. Despite these challenges, the Yak-9T proved invaluable in breaking up German bomber formations and in attacking enemy armor during key offensives. The Battle of Kursk had already demonstrated the utility of heavy-arm variants, and in the following year, Yak-9s with specialized configurations were deployed more widely. Long-range versions such as the Yak-9D and Yak-9DD provided extended escort capability, allowing Soviet bombers to strike targets deeper into enemy territory. In June 1944, Yak-9DDs even escorted American B-17 bombers flying shuttle missions between Allied bases in Italy and Soviet bases in Ukraine, a rare instance of direct cooperation between Soviet and Western forces in the air war. These missions highlighted the Yak-9's adaptability and underscored its strategic importance beyond the Eastern Front. On the ground attack front, Yak-9s were increasingly used to support Soviet offensives. With their cannons and machine guns, they harassed retreating German convoys, attacked rail hubs, and strafed troop concentrations. While less specialized than the Il-2 Stormovik, the Yak-9 could operate in a dual role, switching between air combat and ground attack depending on operational needs. This versatility allowed commanders to maximize the utility of their fighter regiments during fast-moving campaigns, where air superiority and close air support had to be maintained simultaneously. Adaptations also extended to tactics. Soviet air doctrine increasingly emphasized combined arms operations, and Yak-9 units were integrated more closely with ground forces. Pilots received training not only in dogfighting but also in coordinating with artillery and tank units, ensuring that their firepower was applied where it would have the greatest impact. These adjustments mirrored the broader shift in Soviet strategy toward coordinated, deep operations designed to collapse German defensive lines. Losses remained significant. Despite its qualities, the Yak-9 was not invulnerable. Anti-aircraft fire claimed many aircraft, especially during ground attack sorties. Encounters with late-war German fighters, such as the Bf-109K and the Fw-190D, also posed serious threats. In these situations, pilot experience often made the difference. Veterans who had survived earlier stages of the war could exploit the Yak-9's handling advantages, while inexperienced replacements sometimes fell victim to more seasoned Luftwaffe pilots. Nevertheless, the Yak-9's contribution during this period was undeniable. By mid-1944, it was the most numerous Soviet fighter, forming the backbone of air regiments across the Eastern Front. Its adaptability ensured that it could be tailored to different missions, while its availability in large numbers guaranteed that Soviet forces could contest the skies wherever they advanced. The Yak-9 had become not merely a fighter but a tool of strategy, enabling the Soviet Union to maintain pressure on German forces as the Red Army advanced westward. By the end of 1944, the Yak-9 had fully demonstrated its ability to adapt to battlefield needs. It was no longer just a replacement for earlier Yakovlev designs, but a proven platform that had taken on a wide range of combat roles. As the war entered its final year, the Yak-9 would continue to evolve, providing Soviet pilots with an aircraft that could carry them through the decisive campaigns leading to Berlin. The versatility of the Yak-9 reached its peak in the final year of the war, when multiple specialized variants entered production to meet specific operational demands. By early 1945, the Yak-9 was not simply a single fighter type, but a family of aircraft adapted for a wide range of missions, reflecting both the ingenuity of Yakovlev's design bureau and the practical needs of the Red Air Force. One of the most notable developments was the Yak-9U upgraded, which represented a significant refinement of the basic design. Powered by the Klimov VK-107A engine delivering up to 650 horsepower, the Yak-9U offered substantially improved performance. With a maximum speed exceeding 700 km per hour at altitude, it could match late-war German fighters such as the Bf-109G10 and Fw-190D9. To achieve this, engineers reinforced the airframe with greater use of metal construction, making it both stronger and more durable. The Yak-9U entered service in late 1944 and saw extensive combat in 1945, quickly becoming one of the most respected Soviet fighters of the war. Parallel to the Yak-9U was the Yak-9K, armed with a formidable 45mm NS-45 cannon. This variant was intended primarily for destroying heavy bombers and ground targets such as tanks and artillery positions. While its firepower was unmatched, capable of destroying a Bf-109 or Fw-190 with a single hit, the heavy recoil and limited ammunition supply made it difficult to handle. As a result, only a small number of Yak-9Ks were produced, but their presence on the battlefield demonstrated the Soviet commitment to maximizing the offensive potential of the Yak-9 platform. For long-range missions, the Yak-9DD remained the workhorse. With its enlarged fuel capacity, it could escort bombers or conduct patrols up to 1,400 kilometers from base, a vital capability for operations deep into enemy territory. This version was particularly important during shuttle bombing missions with the Allies, when American bombers flew from Italy to Soviet bases and back, escorted by Yak-9DD fighters during the Soviet leg of the operation. These flights not only underscored the Yak-9's adaptability, but also highlighted its role in international cooperation, albeit limited, between the Soviet Union and its Western allies. Ground attack remained another area where Yak-9 variants played a role. The Yak-9T, armed with the 37mm cannon, was especially effective against armored vehicles and fortified positions. Its firepower complemented the Il-2 Sturmovik, adding agility to ground support operations. Soviet records describe Yak-9Ts being employed during the battles in Poland, Hungary, and Germany, where they destroyed convoys, artillery batteries, and even tanks. Although less armored than the Il-2, the Yak-9T's ability to strike quickly and retreat made it an asset in fluid combat situations. Training and reconnaissance also shaped the Yak-9's evolution. Two-seat trainer variants were introduced to facilitate the rapid preparation of new pilots. These trainers, though not intended for combat, were essential for maintaining the Red Air Force's operational strength as attrition remained high throughout 1944-1945. Reconnaissance adaptations, equipped with cameras, were also fielded in limited numbers, giving Soviet forces greater intelligence-gathering capacity in support of advancing ground troops. Production figures underscore the importance of the Yak-9 family. Between 1942 and 1948, more than 16,700 Yak-9s of all variants were built, making it the most produced Soviet fighter of the Second World War. This sheer scale ensured that the Yak-9 was available in every major theater of operations on the Eastern Front. Its combination of adaptability, reliability, and ease of manufacture allowed it to serve in greater numbers than more advanced but resource-intensive aircraft. By the end of the war, the Yak-9 had proven itself as a fighter capable of evolving alongside the demands of combat. From long-range escort to heavy cannon-armed tank buster, from upgraded dogfighter to trainer, its numerous variants ensured that the Red Air Force always had the right tool for the mission. While the Yak-3 remained the most agile and beloved by some pilots, the Yak-9 was the true backbone of Soviet fighter aviation, a platform that combined numbers, adaptability, and constant technological evolution to dominate the Eastern Front. The success of the Yak-9 variants reflected a broader truth about Soviet wartime design: the ability to adapt quickly to battlefield needs without halting production. Each new version was not a replacement for the whole series, but an addition to it, ensuring continuity while expanding capabilities. This philosophy ensured that by 1945, the Yak-9 was not just one of many Soviet fighters, but the defining workhorse of the Red Air Force. The global impact and legacy of the Yak-9 extended far beyond its wartime achievements on the Eastern Front. Though conceived in the crucible of the Soviet-German conflict, the aircraft went on to influence post-war aviation, international military alignments, and the memory of air combat during the Second World War. Its role as both a weapon of war and a symbol of Soviet industrial resilience ensured its place in aviation history. At the global level, the Yak-9 became the Soviet Union's most produced fighter of the war, with over 16,700 units built between 1942 and 1948. This enormous production scale ensured that it not only equipped the Red Air Force in overwhelming numbers, but was also exported to Allied and satellite states during and after the conflict. In the final year of the war, Yak-9s were delivered to the air forces of Poland, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, where they were used in combat against retreating German forces. For these nations, the Yak-9 represented both a practical weapon and a symbol of Soviet support in their liberation struggles. In the immediate post-war years, the Yak-9 remained in service with many of these air forces, even as newer designs began to appear. Poland operated Yak-9s until the early 1950s, integrating them into training and frontline units. Yugoslavia used them during its brief alignment with Moscow before the Tito-Stalin split in 1948 led to their gradual replacement with Western aircraft. Czechoslovakia also employed the Yak-9, though it soon shifted to newer Soviet types as its air force modernized. The aircraft even saw combat service in Asia. During the Chinese Civil War, Yak-9s supplied to the People's Liberation Army Air Force were flown in engagements against nationalist forces. The Yak-9's post-war service highlighted its versatility and durability, but it also underscored the rapid pace of technological change. By the late 1940s, the dawn of the jet age rendered piston engine fighters increasingly obsolete. Within the Soviet Union, the Yak-9 was gradually retired in favor of the Lavochkin La-11 and the Yak-15, one of the USSR's first jet fighters. Nevertheless, the Yak-9 bridged the gap between wartime necessity and post-war modernization, giving the Red Air Force continuity during a period of rapid transition. In terms of influence on future aircraft design, the Yak-9 left a lasting mark on the Yakovlev Design Bureau. Lessons learned in refining airframes, managing weight distribution, and balancing performance with ease of mass production carried into post-war designs. The Yak-9's modular approach, creating multiple variants from a single base design, was replicated in later Soviet aircraft development. It reflected a doctrine of flexibility, ensuring that fighters could be adapted quickly to new roles without halting production, a philosophy that continued into the Cold War. Culturally, the Yak-9 became a symbol of Soviet determination and ingenuity. It was remembered as the aircraft that, along with the Yak-3 and La-7, helped wrest air superiority from the Luftwaffe and maintain it until Germany's defeat. The Yak-9's reputation was reinforced by its association with numerous Soviet aces, many of whom achieved significant portions of their victories in the type. These associations made the Yak-9 central to the Soviet narrative of aerial triumph in the Great Patriotic War. Preserved examples of the Yak-9 can be found in museums across Russia and Eastern Europe, where they serve as physical reminders of the war and its technological legacy. Some remain airworthy in private collections, their presence at air shows ensuring that the aircraft's legacy is not confined to static displays. For veterans who flew them, the Yak-9 was often remembered as a reliable partner in battle. Never the most glamorous of fighters, but dependable, adaptable, and effective. The Yak-9 also occupies a place in international historical debates. Western historians who evaluated captured examples recognized it as a competent and competitive fighter, particularly in its later variants. While it may not have achieved the same fame as the Spitfire or Mustang, it was arguably no less important within its own theater of war. Its significance lay not in revolutionary technology, but in its combination of effectiveness, mass production, and adaptability, the precise qualities needed for victory on the vast Eastern Front. Ultimately, the Yak-9's legacy is one of endurance and transformation. It was the Soviet fighter that dominated the Eastern Front, not simply because of its performance in the air, but because of its ability to be built in extraordinary numbers, adapted to countless roles, and trusted by the pilots who flew it. Its post-war service across multiple countries and its influence on subsequent designs ensured that it lived on long after the guns of 1945 fell silent. In the story of the Second World War and the early Cold War, the Yak-9 stands as both a symbol of Soviet wartime achievement and a bridge into the era of global aviation modernity. Beyond its widespread combat service and celebrated role in Soviet wartime aviation, the Yak-9 also participated in lesser-known episodes that add depth to its historical story. These unseen chapters reveal how the aircraft was used in ways that went beyond the standard roles of air superiority and ground support, reflecting both experimental ambitions and the unpredictable demands of war. One of the most remarkable but often overlooked missions involving the Yak-9 was its participation in the Allied shuttle bombing program known as Operation Frantic in 1944. During this cooperative effort, American bombers flew raids into German-occupied Europe, then landed at Soviet bases to refuel and rearm before striking targets again on their return journey to Italy or Britain. Soviet Yak-9DD long-range fighters were assigned to escort the B-17s and B-24s during the Soviet leg of these missions. This marked one of the very few times during the war that Soviet and American combat aircraft flew side by side in operational missions. Reports from both sides noted the professionalism of the Soviet pilots and the reliability of the Yak-9 in this demanding escort role. While these missions were limited in number, they highlighted the Yak-9's importance not only on the Eastern Front, but in the broader Allied war effort. Another forgotten chapter concerns the Yak-9's use in specialized reconnaissance and testing roles. Several aircraft were fitted with aerial cameras, turning them into tactical reconnaissance machines capable of photographing enemy positions ahead of advancing Soviet troops. While less effective than purpose-built reconnaissance aircraft, the Yak-9's speed and maneuverability allowed it to evade enemy fighters more easily. In the post-war years, some Yak-9s were retained as testbeds for evaluating new equipment, including radio systems and weapon modifications. These experimental uses seldom entered official records but contributed to the gradual modernization of Soviet aviation technology. Veteran accounts also shed light on unusual missions. Some pilots recalled that Yak-9Ts, armed with the 37mm cannon, were occasionally used against German river barges and rail locomotives, targets not typically associated with fighter operations. The destructive power of a single cannon hit made the Yak-9T effective in disrupting supply networks, even though this was not its primary purpose. In some sectors, Yak-9s were tasked with flying free hunt missions, patrols conducted deep into enemy territory to search for isolated convoys or retreating units. These missions were hazardous due to strong German anti-aircraft defenses, but they offered opportunities for pilots to exploit the Yak-9's range and firepower. There were also unrealized projects linked to the Yak-9. Engineers briefly considered adapting the airframe for naval use, exploring the possibility of operating from future Soviet aircraft carriers. Plans were made for strengthening the landing gear and modifying the structure for catapult launches, but the rapid transition to jet aircraft after 1945 ended such ambitions. Similarly, a small number of Yak-9s were modified for experimental rocket-assisted takeoff trials, part of the Soviet investigation into hybrid propulsion during the closing stages of the war. These trials produced limited results, but illustrated how the Yak-9 served as a versatile platform for experimentation. In addition to its official combat record, the Yak-9 became part of personal stories of pilots whose experiences have been preserved in memoirs. Veterans frequently recalled how the aircraft could be both forgiving for inexperienced pilots and formidable in the hands of experts. The visibility from the cockpit, combined with stable handling and tight turns, often gave young aviators a crucial margin of survival in their early missions. For seasoned aces, the Yak-9's adaptability meant it could be flown aggressively in offensive operations without sacrificing reliability. Some missions undertaken by Yak-9 units have been overshadowed by more famous battles, but remain important in historical context. During the Soviet offensives into the Balkans in 1944, Yak-9s played a critical role in establishing air superiority over Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. In these regions, their presence ensured that advancing Soviet and partisan forces were protected from German counterattacks. Though these operations lacked the scale of Kursk or Berlin, they were vital in securing Soviet strategic goals in southeastern Europe. These unseen chapters and forgotten missions underscore the Yak-9's extraordinary flexibility. It was not merely a frontline fighter, but also a tool adapted for reconnaissance, escort, interdiction, and even experimental research. Some of these roles were temporary or improvised, others formed the basis for future innovation. Together, they show that the Yak-9's historical significance extended well beyond the battles most often associated with it. In retrospect, the Yak-9's ability to absorb so many roles speaks to the broader Soviet approach to warfare. Every resource was to be maximized, every machine adapted to meet the needs of the moment. While its primary fame rests on its combat role as the fighter that dominated the Eastern Front, these lesser-known episodes remind us that the Yak-9 was more than just a weapon. It was a versatile instrument of war, a test platform for innovation, and a symbol of the improvisation that often defined the Soviet struggle for survival and eventual victory. The final legacy of the Yak-9 can be understood only by placing it within the broader framework of the Second World War and its aftermath. It was not the fastest nor the most advanced fighter of its era, but it was the right aircraft for the Soviet Union's circumstances, designed and built in numbers that matched the scale of the conflict on the Eastern Front. Its story is one of adaptation, mass production, and the ability to provide Soviet pilots with a machine capable of meeting the Luftwaffe on equal terms at a decisive point in the war. By the end of the war, the Yak-9 had firmly established itself as the most produced Soviet fighter of the conflict, with more than 16,700 units constructed. This sheer number ensured its ubiquity across every major front, from the battlefields of Stalingrad to the skies above Berlin. Its widespread availability allowed Soviet commanders to maintain pressure across vast theaters, ensuring that air superiority could be contested wherever the Red Army advanced. This numerical presence was as important as technical qualities, since Soviet strategy depended on overwhelming the enemy with both numbers and consistent operational tempo. The Yak-9's adaptability was its defining feature. Unlike single-purpose fighters such as the Yak-3, which excelled in dogfights but had limited range, or the heavily armed but specialized Il-2 Sturmovik, the Yak-9 existed as a platform that could be modified to suit varied needs. Whether as a long-range escort in the Yak-9DD, a tank-busting cannon fighter in the Yak-9T and Yak-9K, or a refined dogfighter in the Yak-9U, the aircraft adapted to the changing tactical and strategic requirements of the Red Air Force. This flexibility ensured its relevance throughout the war and into the early post-war years. In operational terms, the Yak-9 played a decisive role in securing Soviet air dominance from 1943 onward. At Kursk, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and across the Balkans, Yak-9 units supported ground offensives by denying the Luftwaffe freedom of action. By 1944, the German Air Force was increasingly on the defensive, and the Yak-9's presence, combined with mass Soviet production of aircraft, contributed to this reversal. In the final battles over Poland and Germany, Yak-9 regiments provided escort for bombers and ground support for armored spearheads, ensuring that Soviet troops could advance under cover of friendly skies. Its legacy was also shaped by the experiences of the pilots who flew it. For many, the Yak-9 represented a turning point in their ability to compete with German fighters. Veterans recalled that its forgiving handling characteristics allowed inexperienced pilots to survive their early missions, while more experienced aces could exploit its maneuverability and speed. Figures such as Alexander Pokrishkin, Ivan Kozhedub, and countless other Soviet pilots added to the Yak-9's reputation, making it synonymous with Soviet air victories during the later years of the war. Internationally, the Yak-9's legacy extended into post-war years, as it was adopted by several Soviet-aligned nations. It became the first modern fighter for countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and even saw service in Asia with the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force. Though rapidly overtaken by jet aircraft, its post-war service ensured that the Yak-9 influenced the early development of these nations' air forces and introduced them to Soviet aviation doctrine. Culturally, the Yak-9 retained a place in the Soviet memory of the Great Patriotic War. It was frequently displayed in post-war air shows, commemorated in literature and film, and preserved in museums. Its association with victory, combined with its mass production, made it an enduring symbol of Soviet resilience and ingenuity. For many, it was remembered not as the sleekest or most glamorous fighter, but as the dependable machine that brought victory within reach. In aviation history, the Yak-9 stands as an example of wartime pragmatism, a design not focused on radical innovation, but on creating a versatile and effective aircraft that could be built in enormous numbers under challenging conditions. Its influence carried forward into post-war Soviet aircraft design, where the principle of modular development, adapting a single airframe for multiple purposes, remained central. The Yak-9's ultimate significance lies in the combination of its combat role, its industrial impact, and its symbolic weight. It dominated the Eastern Front not through any single quality, but through the sum of its attributes: adaptability, mass production, and reliability. In doing so, it reflected the broader Soviet war effort, an achievement of scale, endurance, and determination. Even as the jet age rendered it obsolete within a few years, its historical legacy endures as the Soviet fighter that embodied both the struggle and the triumph of the Red Air Force in the Second World War. The closing chapters of the Yak-9's history during the war reveal how deeply integrated it became into the Soviet strategy of final victory. By early 1945, the Red Army was advancing into Eastern Europe, pushing through Poland, Hungary, and into Germany itself. In each of these operations, Yak-9 regiments played crucial roles, ensuring that Soviet troops could rely on consistent fighter cover, bomber escort, and tactical ground support. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, Yak-9 units were deployed en masse to support the Red Army's rapid advance across Poland. The offensive relied heavily on maintaining momentum, and Soviet air forces used their Yak-9s to deny German aircraft the ability to disrupt supply lines or counterattack advancing armor. Reports from this campaign show that Yak-9s flew hundreds of sorties daily, escorting bombers targeting German defensive strongpoints and conducting patrols to intercept any remaining Luftwaffe fighters. German resistance was sporadic but dangerous. Late-war Bf-109K and Fw-190D aircraft were encountered, but Soviet numerical superiority and the Yak-9's performance gave the Red Air Force the upper hand. In Hungary, during the battles around Budapest in late 1944 and early 1945, Yak-9Ts and Yak-9Ks were employed in ground attack missions against German armored units attempting to relieve the encircled city. Their heavy cannons proved effective in disabling tanks and disrupting supply convoys, complementing the work of the Il-2 Sturmovik. These missions were risky, as German anti-aircraft defenses were concentrated around urban centers, but the Yak-9's speed allowed them to strike quickly and withdraw before heavier flak could engage. Pilots reported mixed success. While the heavy cannon-equipped versions were deadly when their rounds connected, the low ammunition capacity often limited their effectiveness in prolonged engagements. As the war drew to its climax, the Yak-9 was heavily involved in the Battle of Berlin. Soviet air planners committed vast numbers of fighters to ensure absolute dominance of the skies above the German capital. Yak-9 regiments were tasked with bomber escort, air patrols, and ground attack missions against German troops defending the city. Luftwaffe resistance, though desperate, was limited in scale, and the Yak-9s, alongside other Soviet fighters, ensured that German aircraft could not significantly influence the outcome of the battle. The presence of Yak-9s over Berlin symbolized the Soviet Union's ability to project overwhelming air power at the decisive moment of the war. The conclusion of hostilities in May 1945 marked the peak of the Yak-9's wartime journey. By then, it had served in virtually every conceivable role: dogfighter, bomber escort, tank buster, reconnaissance platform, and long-range escort. Its widespread presence across all Soviet fronts made it the most familiar fighter to both pilots and ground crews. Veterans often described it as the workhorse of Soviet aviation, less glamorous than some aircraft but indispensable in its reliability and adaptability. The immediate post-war months further emphasized the Yak-9's significance. It remained in active service as the Soviet Union transitioned from wartime operations to peacetime defense. Large numbers were handed over to the air forces of Soviet allies in Eastern Europe, ensuring that the Yak-9 became one of the first instruments of Soviet influence in the emerging Cold War. In this way, the Yak-9 bridged the gap between wartime necessity and post-war geopolitics, carrying its legacy beyond the battlefield. Thus, in its final wartime chapters, the Yak-9 was more than just another fighter. It was the embodiment of the Soviet strategy of mass, flexibility, and resilience. It had evolved to meet every demand placed upon it, from the desperate days of Stalingrad to the triumphant flights over Berlin. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, the Yak-9 had not only contributed to Soviet victory, but had established itself as one of the defining aircraft of the Second World War. The legacy of the Yak-9 extends far beyond its role as a wartime fighter, reaching into the post-war decades and leaving an enduring mark on aviation history. While its service in frontline combat ended with the close of the Second World War, its impact on military doctrine, international relations, and cultural memory continued for years to come. One of the Yak-9's most lasting contributions was its influence on post-war Soviet aircraft development. The Yakovlev Bureau applied the lessons learned from the Yak-9 directly to later designs, including the Yak-9P, an all-metal development that replaced the wooden components of earlier models. Introduced shortly after the war, the Yak-9P was intended to provide Soviet and Allied air forces with a more durable fighter during the transitional years before jet aircraft became standard. Although quickly overshadowed by jets such as the MiG-9 and MiG-15, the Yak-9P ensured continuity and allowed many nations to maintain operational fighter fleets during the late 1940s. Internationally, the Yak-9 became one of the most widely exported Soviet fighters of the immediate post-war era. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania all received Yak-9s for their newly reconstituted air forces. In Asia, China operated Yak-9s supplied by the Soviet Union, and they played a role in the Chinese Civil War as communist forces built an air arm capable of contesting the skies with nationalist opponents. In North Korea, Yak-9s were also part of the early Korean People's Air Force and flew combat missions in the opening stages of the Korean War, before being replaced by more advanced jets. These international deployments extended the Yak-9's combat record well into the late 1940s, making it a bridge between the Second World War and the early Cold War. Doctrinally, the Yak-9 helped shape Soviet and Allied approaches to air warfare. Its versatility demonstrated the value of a fighter platform that could be adapted to multiple roles, a lesson that continued into the jet age. The Soviet emphasis on producing families of aircraft with shared components, seen later in the MiG and Sukhoi designs, owed much to the philosophy embodied in the Yak-9. Its success reinforced the idea that adaptability and ease of production could be as valuable as raw performance, particularly in large-scale conflicts where attrition was constant. In cultural terms, the Yak-9 became an enduring symbol of Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War. While the Yak-3 was often celebrated as the most agile Soviet fighter and the La-7 as a pinnacle of piston engine design, the Yak-9 was remembered as the most numerous and widely used. It was the aircraft that most Soviet pilots encountered during their service, and its presence in memoirs, literature, and film cemented its role in the collective memory of the war. Monuments and museum displays across Russia and Eastern Europe frequently feature the Yak-9, emphasizing its role not only as a machine of war but as a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. Today, several Yak-9s survive in museums and private collections around the world. A few have been restored to flying condition, allowing modern audiences to witness the aircraft in motion at air shows. These rare survivors keep alive the memory of the thousands that once filled the skies of the Eastern Front. For historians and enthusiasts, the Yak-9 serves as a tangible reminder of the industrial, tactical, and human dimensions of the conflict. Ultimately, the Yak-9's historical significance lies in its balance of qualities. It was not the fastest nor the most technologically advanced fighter of the Second World War, but it was built in the right numbers at the right time and in the right form to meet the needs of the Soviet Union. It carried the Red Air Force from desperate defensive battles to the triumph of Berlin, and it continued to shape global aviation in the first years of the Cold War. Its story is one of adaptability, scale, and endurance, qualities that ensured its place as the Soviet fighter that dominated the Eastern Front and left a lasting legacy in the annals of aviation history.